Thanks. Thanks for having me come out. It's fun to be here. And, my mind's actually really in this stuff that I'm doing with Jason, using Miami data and looking at leadership. So now I'm going to have to pull back and go, because that's what we've been doing today. So I'm going to go and talk to you about some stuff I've been doing in New York with two of my colleagues, Matt Ronfeld, who's now at the University of Michigan, and Jim Wyckoff at the University of Virginia. And basically what happened is I was interested for something that was happening in the state of California on the effects of teacher turnover. So there was, they had to fire a bunch of people, and it turned out, particularly in LA, it was all coming from pretty much the same 4 schools because the new teachers were so concentrated in those schools. And so I said, well, they asked me to write a brief about the potential effects of this, and I went and said, okay, I'll go look at the literature on the effects of teacher turnover, and there was no literature, as far as I could tell, on the effects of teacher turnover on student achievement. So this is not a study that went and found good identification for the effects of teacher turnover on student achievement. It basically does as well as we could do with the data that we had to try to get a good estimate of how teacher turnover affects student achievement. And I think it's pretty compelling, but you push back and tell me either why it might not be or how I might be able to do it in an even more compelling way. And if you interrupt me, I'll think you're listening, so feel free to interrupt me. Okay, so background, I think many people at Vanderbilt know this better than I do, but nationally about 30% of teachers leave the profession after 5 years. I think about 50% is about 8 years. It's about 50% higher in high poverty schools than in affluent ones, and higher rates in urban and low performing schools, which you probably also have a sense of. In New York City, where I do my research and the study comes out, about 20% of teachers leave their school each year. So we can think about turnover from the profession, but in terms of what's happening in terms of an organization like a school, we should think about 20% of teachers. And in the stuff that I've done with Jason, too, about 25% of principals leave their school each year. So, there's a pretty high turnover of adults in schools. Let's see. So often teacher turnover is assumed that it harms student achievement. I don't know why I do this. But as I was saying, there's very little direct evidence on it. And largely the evidence that's been used to show that teacher turnover is bad is just that teacher turnover is higher in low-performing schools. But clearly that is far from causal, because low-performing teachers are turning over from low-performing schools, largely because low-performing schools aren't as fun to work in often. There's also in the organizational management literature an idea that turnover can be beneficial. It brings in new ideas. It allows better person-job match. So in economics, when I went to look, I was just saying to Jason, nobody studied the effect of turnover on firm production either in the broader economics literature. It's often assumed to be positive because people are moving to better matches. So what I wanted to hypothesize how turnover, in a very simple way, how turnover might affect student achievement. So if you have kind of the learning of the kids, I was thinking, well, that has something to do with both the student determines his or her own learning, as well as the quality of instruction that she gets, that student receives. And that quality of instruction in terms, again, very simple model, has something to do with peers, things going on in the classroom, the quality of the teacher, who the teacher is, and also some kind of context or supports in the schools. So if you get a teacher who is a kind of mediocre, pretty good, he or she might be much better, and you might learn much more if there are supports in the school, for example, that helps the teacher with a particularly disruptive student, or provides support for something the teacher doesn't know as much about, or even as an individual child provides you with some support to help you get the most out of the classroom. So those 3 things, it's a very simple idea. And so what kind of things, I guess I just said this, could be in context. It could be kind of coordination among teachers. I I was saying all these positive things it could be, but it could also be negative. If you're in a school that really requires you as a teacher to help other teachers, that could mean that it takes time away from you in your classroom. And so even though you're a really good teacher, your students don't learn as much. And then it could just be resources and things like that. Okay, so we're back to this. Quality of instruction is a function of the characteristics of the students, the teacher, and the context. And then we have teacher turnover. And at least in my mind, teacher turnover can definitely affect who the teachers are, who the individual teachers are. And I'm going to call that the compositional effect of teacher turnover. So it's the turnover impact due to the change in the composition of teachers, who's teaching. And then teacher turnover can also affect this context in the school. And I'm going to call that either disruption or innovation. I'm mostly going to call it disruption, but disruption has a negative connotation, and I don't want it to necessarily have a negative connotation. Its effects beyond changes in the composition, and it could either be these new ideas that come in, or it could be like lost institutional knowledge that has to be rebuilt. So it can go either way. So what do we know about these things? The composition, this is like so obvious, I don't know why I'm saying it, because I'm sure you already get it. The effect of the composition can be different depending on who leaves and who comes, right? If you have better people leave, it's bad. If you have better people coming in, it's good. It's more beneficial when the leavers are less effective. Generally, the literature suggests that more effective teachers are more likely to stay at their school, particularly in the first couple of years of teaching. Now, in New York, when we've looked at it, I think I have a link to this. In New York, it's actually limited to the first-year teachers, as far as we can tell. We don't see that after the first year, that better teachers stay in the same school. But in Miami, when we look at it, it does look like it's not just the first-year teachers, it's other teachers. If you're more effective, there are reasons more effective teachers would stay in their school. I mean, being effective is a pleasant, working condition. I think that it's nice to feel effective. I have this link, if my technology works, which just doesn't. So when I looked this is New York City, you can see this negative 0.026. So teachers who make about 2 or 3% of a standard deviation more achievement on kids, which is about, 8% of a teacher effect or something like that. Maybe I'm underestimating that. Anyway, that much. They're the ones who transfer to other schools in the district relative to the ones who stay. So I don't know if you're comfortable looking at that, but it just means that it's negative, and it's actually negative across all different types of schools. One of the interesting things is that it's the higher performing schools, the worst teachers are more likely to transfer to other schools, where in the lower scoring schools, the worst teachers are more likely to leave the district altogether. So, but together, it comes out that this idea that the worst teachers are more likely to leave goes for both high and low performing schools. It's not just in one and not the other. Yeah.
Is this true across all different elementary, middle, high school? Is this phenomenon true across these things?
I think it's true. That's a good question. I don't know. I should look at that. Do you remember that in Miami? The vast majority of this work looks at elementary schools. So my worry in middle schools is that middle school teachers leave to go to high schools. And I think on average those are the better middle school teachers. So that might not be right in the first year, but so I don't know, I guess is the answer. So I know there is that movement from middle to high schools, but I think the Goldhaber stuff in North Carolina and the Hanishik and Rifkin in Texas are both elementary school studies. Even in underserved schools, so it calls into the question of whether turnover is harmful, but again, we don't know really who comes in to replace those teachers. And I mean, my guess is it's more like an average teacher who comes in, but there's been no real study of who replaces them, so we can't really conclude totally that the compositional changes are positive, but they tend to be there's some evidence that they might be a little bit positive. Okay, so we did, this is, I don't know, this is like shameful promotion of other research that I've done. But we did do, I'm going to do this here and then in another one, but it's just kind of what's in my mind as examples of this. So we did give, and this is to kind of help in the talk motivate what we're trying to look at here. We did for New York do a simulation. If they had to lay off teachers, how much better would it be in terms of student achievement to lay off low achieving teachers versus low seniority teachers? And so if you lay off the youngest teachers, they come from throughout the teacher effectiveness distribution. They're kind of towards the negative part because new teachers are less effective, but you can see you're going to get rid of some very high performing teachers if you lay off by seniority. But if you lay off by value added or teacher effectiveness, you just get rid of the worst teachers. And if you looked at their current effectiveness, those teachers who would get laid off are 31% of a student standard deviation worse on their current performance. So that's really big. That's 2 times the standard deviation of teacher performance. It's like a really big difference. But then the reason I made this point is because then we look 2 years out. And if you look 2 years out, the value added is only partially predictive of how good you'll be later. So even though we got rid of the ones who are doing worse, 2 years out, they're still worse, between 70 and 100% of a standard deviation worse in terms of teacher value added, but not nearly as worse as if we didn't look 2 years out and we just looked at their effect at the time we might get rid of them. Does that make some sense? Okay, so it's just nice to think about value added. So that's the compositional change. And so all to say is that we see compositional changes about low achieving or low value added teachers leaving, but they're not huge. And in New York, they're not at all after the first year. And also, you're being negative at one point only partially suggests that you'll be negative. At another point, though, there is somewhat correlation or pretty strong correlation, so you probably will be negative later on. Okay, so that's the compositional change. The disruptive change, turnover may have a disruptive change beyond it. Even when leavers are the same quality as replacements, turnover may disrupt learning. We talked a little bit about this. There's startup costs, there's lost relationships, there's lost institutional knowledge, and there's no research that we know of that has looked at all at disruptional change. Now, in my next self-promotion, there is something that we've done that's looked at, to give you an idea that there could be disruptive change. So, I mean, maybe that everybody believes that immediately, but I was talking again to this group of economists who were like, disruptional change, that doesn't, wasn't a very believable concept. But one thing that we did, which at least to me suggested that there was some, that we had to worry about this aside from just seeing that there's disruptive things in school, was looking at the effects of principal turnover. So in a previous study, we just kind of looked at the effects of principal turnover, and I won't go through this, but we basically looked at whether student achievement was higher or lower when their principal was new, compared to how well that student did in other years. And we did things like control for the prior years, so that if the principal had a really bad year and then it looked like it jumped up or something, we adjusted for all of that. And it really did turn out that kids do worse in the year that there's a first principal, a new principal in the school. And it's almost all driven by first-time principals. So when there's a first-time principal in the school, the kids do worse in that year relative to how that same kid does in other years. And it's worse for kids who have new teachers. Which may be just because the principal has more effect on the lives. It's easier to disrupt the life of a new teacher than it is other teachers. So anyway, this is just some evidence that there may be a disruptive change in the school. So this research has 3 questions. You all good? We all ready to? That was motivation. Now let's move on to the study. What is the average effect of teacher turnover on student achievement? Are the effects different for different kinds of schools? And to what extent are these effects compositional versus disruptive? Okay. And the second one is kind of boring, but okay, I'm going to ask it anyway. I'm going to use data on New York City 4th and 5th grade students. And of course, you know, it's easy to do work. All this work goes on in elementary schools, the kind of research, because data is available, and that's really why we're doing it here. What's good about 4th and 5th grade is that we can link students to their teachers. We have test scores on their learning gains. And we have that in middle schools as well. But what in middle schools, since kids have more than one teacher, it's very hard to know whose turnover we're thinking about. And so should I, for example, in middle school, should I be worried about math achievement when a math teacher turns over, or should that teacher be a 6th grade teacher or a 7th grade teacher? It's just very hard for us to know whom the teacher's turnover should affect, whereas in 4th grade, I can think, okay, let's think about the turnover of 4th grade teachers and how that affects 4th graders. There are approximately 850,000 student observations over the 8 years from 2001. Well, it's actually 2000, 2001, 2002, and then we skip 2003 because the data's bad. The same results will come if we just look at 2005 to 2010, but this includes the other data as well. We have student test scores in math and English language arts, links to students' classes, schools, and teacher characteristics. Like this slide, I think I could have in so many of my talks. So this is the exciting side of approximately 50% female students in the district. We have 37% Hispanic, 32% Black, 64% free lunch, 8% reduced price lunch. You know, it's New York. It's got a lot of poor kids, a diverse ethnic backgrounds. They average about 10 or 11 days absent per year. These are just some of the information we have on them. I'm not sure any of that. That's just the aggregate, so we have aggregate class sizes. So what are we going to do? We're going to say, let me try to motivate this a little bit. What I'd like to be able to say is, what is the effect on the kids in a school if teachers turn over from that school? But it's a very hard thing to do because you don't know what else was going on in that school. And so instead, what I'm going to be looking at is school by grade turnover in a particular year, and I'm going to get my identification of the effects by comparing grades within the same school in different years and things similar to that. So I'm going to be asking what happens to student achievement in a given year as a function of the percent of teachers in the student's current grade that turned over before that, before that year. And then I'm going to run 2 classes of fixed effects models to get at that. So 2 different identification strategies. First, I'm going to put in a grade by school fixed effect and then a year fixed effect. And what that's going to do is I'm going to be comparing the 4th grade in East Elementary School in 2008 to that same 4th grade in East Elementary School in 2009. And I'm going to say, if turnover is higher in one year, do kids perform worse? And then as a check, I'm also going to put in school by year fixed effects and grade fixed effects. And that one's going to say, in a particular year, in a particular school, so a particular year in a particular school, if the turnover is higher in 5th grade than it is in 4th grade, do the 5th graders do worse than the 4th graders in their learning? So let's walk through why these different things might get rid of some of the biases we were talking about and what I'm not doing, because I'm not doing everything. So we consider principal turnover or other school level shock causing turnover. Okay, so let's say the principal leaves, like I was just saying, we think that's a shock. The negative shock would probably be in the prior year and not in the year of having all these new teachers. So that's one thing to think about. But the other thing is that school by year effects should adjust for this. By comparing the 4th grade to the 5th grade in the same school in the same year, if the principal turned over, I would think that would have the same effect on 4th and 5th graders, so it should be okay. Okay, consider teacher conflict in a given grade causing conflict. Hopefully nobody's familiar with the school my daughter goes to, but we have a 3rd grade teacher who is just really difficult to work with. She's a terrific teacher, but all the other teachers in her grade leave whenever they can. So in this case, the negative effect might be this teacher who causes this, again, might be in the prior year, but school by grade effect should get this. So as long as I continue to compare the 3rd grade in the school that my kid goes to, it's going to be okay because that teacher keeps being a pain, okay? It's funny, I didn't even consider that before. So consider teacher attrition because they know the next year will be bad. Okay, so we know next year is going to be bad. If the whole school will be bad, then the school by year effect should take care of it. But if it's just their grade that's going to be bad, I'm in trouble. And this doesn't get around it. So that's a potential worry, that if the teachers leave because they know that something's going to happen next year, just in particular in their grade that they don't want to happen, then this identification isn't so good. Now that I've said that, you're like, okay, get off, leave. Because, but wait, hopefully not. I do try to get around it with something, but it's not that successful. Okay, so the basic model is that student achievement in a given year is a function of the same student's achievement a year earlier, both in that subject, like so if it's student achievement in math, it's the prior year's math, the prior year's English language arts, that's the other, a whole bunch of characteristics that were in that list about the student. I've aggregated up the student characteristics to the classroom level, so you've got characteristics of the kids in the classroom, including their prior test scores and the standard deviation of their prior test scores, school characteristics, the year fixed effect, the grade by school fixed effect, teacher turnover. And what I want is beta 6, which is the teacher turnover. I think I wrote this all out. Whoops. And so there is my year fixed effect and my grade by school fixed effect, and then sometimes instead of that, I have a grade fixed effect and a school by year fixed effect. Yeah.
So, I have a question about the principal.
Yeah.
So a few slides back, I thought you were showing us that the impact of a new principal was particularly was larger if you were yourself a new teacher.
If you were a novice teacher, so if you were in you're mostly in your 2nd year, but yeah.
Right. So in that case, a school year effect wouldn't do it, right? Because I mean, if you had the new teachers were in the 4th grade, not the 5th grade, you'd expect to see the effect there.
Because you would have it in the year where you had new teachers with the new principal.
Well, your new principal effect, your school by year effect is going to be whatever the average of that is.
Right.
It won't capture anything that's particularly happening in the grade that has the turnover.
Yes, so let me think about that for a second. I mean, we did do some of these where we controlled for having new principals in there. So we have like those basic controls in there. But I haven't looked at interactions of the turnover with that. New York, in fact, is different than Miami. So the principal thing comes in Miami, but not the fact that we haven't looked at the effect of principal turnover in New York, but principals essentially don't switch schools in New York. You can't do a principal kind of effectiveness thing in New York because they go into a school and they just stay, and if they leave, they're gone. So it's kind of a different world in terms of principals, but it could be a principal turnover thing, but we did try an adjustment for that. Yeah?
So when you look at the turnover, do you distinguish layoff and turnover, or all of them are equally?
Yes, we can't. Well, we can distinguish layoffs from turnover here, but during this period until last year, New York really didn't lay off anybody except for unprofessional behavior. So it's such a small minority, you can't really get very much from it. So there was probably some turnover that was due to kind of counseling out, but there's hardly anybody identified as actually being laid off in New York until last year, and now a whole bunch. So, Okay, so it seems like measuring turnover would be a straightforward thing since we've just been saying, okay, turnover in the grade, but it turns out that it's not because teachers move around across grades. And if teachers move across grades, what do you count as turnover? And also grades increase and decrease, and do you count those things as turnover? Because of that, I'm going to use two different measures of turnover. I want to measure at the grade by year level in order to use this fixed effect approach. Okay, there. So the first thing I do is lagged attrition, essentially. It's the proportion of teachers in a given grade level in a given, who were there in the prior year who are no longer in the school in the current year. So that if you have a grade 3 and there are 6 teachers in there and 3 of them left the school and the other 3 are still there in the next year, your lagged attrition would be 50%. But it would also be 50% if 3 teachers just switched to the other grade. Okay? And we did that because if we're thinking as disruption as kind of lost knowledge, we didn't really think it was lost knowledge if they were just still in the school. Now, there are still new teachers in the grade, so we have to think about what that means. But in our first one, we wanted it to be, if you're still there, your knowledge is still there, it's not going to count as disruption. But the second one, we're doing the proportion new to the school in a given year, and this is the proportion of teachers in a given grade, not who left the school, but who come into the school. So if you had... well, you get it. I'm about to give you a chart that shows this. So grade switchers in this one we don't include grade switchers as leaving or coming to the school. We actually did a specification in this next round of turnover stuff that wasn't in the paper that I sent in to you, that the results actually don't differ that much in terms of the effect of turnover if you allow the grade switchers in there. Though it might be a little bit lower, but still all the significance and stuff holds up. So this just shows you some examples of where proportion new and lagged attrition give you the same or different answers. So let's say you have the constant number of teachers. You have 6 teachers in 2004 and 6 teachers in 2000 in the next year. 5 of them stay and 1 of them move. The turnover rate is 1/6 because that is the lagged attrition because that one left the school, and so it's 1 over the initial 6, and so is the proportion new because you have 1 new person coming in and replacing them. So that's really easy. But let's say you started with 7 teachers and you went to 6 teachers and they all stayed. Okay? The turnover rate is 1 in 7 in terms of lagged attrition, but it's 0 in terms of proportion new. Okay, and similarly, if you have a growth in teachers, you could have a lagged attrition of 0 and still a proportion new that's positive. And then there's the possibility that teachers can change grades. So even if you have a constant number of teachers, if there are 4 teachers in the grade and 2 teachers change grade and are replaced by new teachers, then the lagged attrition is 0, but the proportion new is 1/2. Okay. And maybe you can think of a way that I could get a turnover rate where I could just use 1 turnover rate, but we've been thinking about it a bit, and there are different ways of just using 1 turnover, but it's kind of conceptually easier for me to think about it in these 2 different ways. Okay, so what do we see? Okay. About 86% of teachers stay. So I said about 20% of teachers turned over across schools, but 4th and 5th grade are more stable than most other grades, so only about 14% turnover each year. If you looked at the lagged attrition turnover, it's about 11%, and the proportion new is about 13%. And so they're kind of similar on average. The one thing to note is in a particular grade in a particular year, lots of times there is no attrition. or no turnover. So 58% of grades in a given year don't have any, and 51% don't have any new teachers. So basically, what's interesting is if you look at the turnover across grades for the end grade school, like an individual East Elementary School, 4th grade or something like that, each of those over the whole time period, it's a very nice distribution of turnover rate. You know, it's pretty much a little bit skewed, but pretty much normal. But if you look just in one year in a particular grade in a particular school, then the turnover, there are lots of them that don't have any turnover, which is not surprising, but it'll just help to remember that when we interpret the results. Okay, before I go into the results, do you have any questions? No? Okay. I don't have, I didn't bring a clock, so probably get out of here in like 5 minutes or something. Okay, so in the models that we have 2 sets of models here. This is with school by year fixed effects. So this is the one I like better, but Matt liked the other one better. So what this is comparing the 4th and 5th grade in East Elementary School in the same year. And this has grade indicators. This has all the student, class, school controls. Basically what this is showing is it doesn't really matter if you have all these detailed controls in. And that's kind of nice to see, because if controls made a lot of difference, then we'd worry that we needed more controls. So what you see is that on average, kids learn about 7% of a standard deviation in test scores less in years with like a whole 1 lagged attrition, a whole, going from 0 lagged attrition to 100% lagged attrition. So 7% of a standard deviation is actually high. It's about a little less than twice the effect of the difference between a first-year teacher and other teachers. So it looks like a big amount, but that's for the difference between 0 and 100% turnover. It's a little higher when we look at proportion new to the school than when we look at lagged attrition. So maybe there's something a little more about having new teachers than losing the old ones. But so one way of thinking about that is maybe it's a little more that teachers who are there have to help the new teachers than it is the other way around, that information leaves. But it's very similar, really, across those. They're certainly not I guess they're close to statistically different, but not, but maybe not.
Susanna,
Yeah.
can you remind us what the mean school by year turnover on each of those measures was, like 20%?
No, it's 11 and 13%, but I'll give you the results in a 10%. Yeah, a little more than, yeah. So it's not a huge effect at the 10% level. The turnover is not evenly distributed across schools, of course, but the other thing is it hits everyone, right? And so it's not an effect that's just held by one kid. It's the average across all kids in the grade. This is when you put in school by grade effects. It's a little bouncier, but basically the results are the same. They're a little smaller for English language arts than for math. They're a little bit bigger with proportion new than lagged attrition, but they're very similar in these 2 identification strategies. Okay, this is just the interpretation. Okay, we'll skip that. Okay, so one thing, and this is getting, Will, at your question, is that because in a given year 58% or 55% of classrooms don't have any lagged attrition, what you see is the first 2 quartiles on average of classrooms in terms of their lagged attrition have 0 lagged attrition. But then the 3rd quartile has 15% lagged attrition, and the top 25% on average have 37% lagged attrition. So 37%, a fair number of classrooms have 37%, or a quarter have 37% lagged attrition. And so what we did was, instead of doing it as a continuous variable, we did the same thing by the quartiles of your, are you in a high quartile attrition or medium quartile versus no attrition, essentially. And what you can see is that that medium quartile is about 9 0.009 or 0.008 standard deviations to be in the third quartile versus none, and to be in the fourth quartile versus none is about 0.03, a little less than 0.03. And again, that little less than 0.03 is a little less than the effect of having a first-year teacher in New York. Yeah?
Can you see if it, I guess I can't remember, but I was wondering if this lingers too, like for the next year, do the students still have kind of a lingering
Effect
effect?
of turnover. I don't know that, but that's an interesting question. And I don't get at too, I mean, I think what people worry about a lot is their schools with, just always having turnover.
I was getting at, this is continually happening in first, second, third grade. What you would actually be capturing here is just kind of the accumulation of these turnovers and not a particular year. Is that right?
Not really, actually, because I think, if anything, we may be underestimating, because we're trying to get out the effect of the school, essentially, and if we think it's kind of a school-level problem, then we are taking that out, and we're just comparing within the same school in 2 different years or 2 different grades.
You're comparing the 4th and 5th grade?
Either the 4th and 5th grade or the same grade in that school in 2 different years.
Okay.
So I think one of the questions and one of the reasons we wanted to find some kind of other way, this doesn't look at the big effect of being in a low-functioning school that has a lot of turnover. But on the other hand, you might think some schools with a lot of turnover then don't have institutional knowledge to lose. And in that sense, or they've kind of created structures that allow for turnover, so it may not be quite as bad. The kind of marginal effect of more turnover may not be quite as bad in those schools. So I don't really know how to disentangle lots and lots of long-term turnover from just being in an ineffective school. Similar results with school by, this one is with ELA. So that's math, and that's ELA. I'm sure you picked up all those numbers. There'll be a quiz at the end. Okay, so the interpretation is that reducing attrition from 37% to none is about a 3% of a standard deviation increase in math. And that's the difference between 2.2 teachers leaving and no teachers leaving in the average elementary school grade in New York. It's roughly the same magnitude as the coefficient on free lunch eligibility. Now, free lunch eligibility is a tricky thing on learning. That's not true in kind of the average difference between free lunch kids and non-free lunch kids, but it's about the same amount different in how much a free lunch kid learns during the year versus other kids. Okay, are the effects different in different kinds of schools? You ready? Oh, so let me tell you. So when we were hypothesizing, you can look at endless different kinds of schools, but this was not kind of a huge part of this, and we were more interested in the compositional versus disruptive change, but we just wanted to see if it was driven totally by one kind of school or another. And the particular thing we were interested in, there were 2, I guess. One is what Ron was talking about, which are the kind of lower performing schools, maybe that see a lot more turnover. Is it just driven by those schools, or is it driven just by high-performing schools or something like that, because the possibility that turnover could be more disruptive there? So that's one thing we wanted to get at. And a second thing that we wanted to get at was, and so we look at that in 2 ways. One by the achievement level of the school, and one by the proportion of African-American kids in the school. And the reason we do the African-American kids is because in New York City, those are the schools that lose more of their teachers. It's achievement and race that really seems to be strongly correlated instead of poverty with teacher turnover. So we're going to look at those 2 characteristics of the schools. And then we're going to look at, and then New York started all these new schools, these new small schools, and we wanted to make sure that it wasn't driven by turnover in new schools or in small schools. So we're going to look at new versus old and small versus big, or small versus regular schools. Okay, so high achieving, low black, high black schools, and the effects tend to be worse they're there for all the schools, but they tend to be stronger in the low achieving, higher proportion African American schools. Some of these differences, like between lagged attrition in these two, are not statistically significant, so I can't say for sure, but the trend is for it to be worse in schools that on average tend to lose more teachers, which are the low achieving and the higher proportion African American.
I should have asked this a long time ago.
Yeah.
I made sure I haven't been listening. But I thought I understand that lag attrition is a grade level measure.
Yeah.
But I thought proportion new was a school level measure.
No, it's still proportion new to your grade in that year. Sorry, so all of the identification is coming from the same, from the school by grade in the year, school year grade thing. Now, so this is on average. In all honesty, I don't have it here, but since I did this paper, I've been looking in the very low achieving, very high proportion black schools. It's actually not quite as strong, the effect. So it's more in the kind of low to mid and not the extreme schools in the extremely low performing schools in the district. But it is kind of still, this still holds. Same thing when you look at school by grade effects. Okay, the negative effect of turnover is larger in low performing schools, though this varies across models and in schools with more black students. So now old and new. So our worry is that it would be driven by the new schools because all of this churning was going on, or the small schools, and what you see is that largely, well, completely really, it's driven by the old schools. The effects are similar on average in the new schools, but it's certainly true that this is not at all driven by the schools that came into New York kind of in the 2004 on period. The effects, again, are pretty similar between small and big schools. So some models show that it's a little bigger in small schools, and some show it's a little bigger in big schools, but generally they're not statistically different. Okay, not much difference between big and small schools, larger effects at old schools. Oh, just as a random comment, new schools are so interesting because, or is it small? Small schools are so interesting because we have this great data in New York where we have all the teachers that apply to go to schools and all the ones that apply to leave schools. And what you see is that all teachers want to go to small schools. It's much, that gets a big plus in the application of teachers to schools. It's the only thing that works in the opposite direction. So lots of teachers also want to leave small schools. So there's something about small schools. I think either they work or they don't work. So if they work, they're great places to be. They're very supportive. And if they don't work, or if you can't get the support you need, you have to leave. Everything else, if it's I don't know what kinds of schools are appealing. High achieving schools. People want to go there and they don't want to leave. Everything else works in that way except for small schools, which it just gets more people in both directions. Okay. So what explains the relationship between teacher turnover and student achievement? And this one you have to push me on because how can I possibly separate these effects? Not well. So, so the idea is, what would be a compositional effect? Basically, I'm going to try to get rid of the compositional effect to see if there's still a disruptive effect. And the first way I'm going to do it, well, I guess I should, So the first way I'm going to do it is say, well, one thing that happens in a compositional effect is that the experience of the teachers change. You tend to lose more experienced teachers and get in less experienced teachers. That is not always the effect because you could get in a teacher with lots and lots of experience, but on average, teachers who are new to the school tend to have less experience. So I want to get rid of the effect of experience. The other thing is that being new to a school might just have difficulties, and what's I'm picking up is just like a mover effect, that I'm getting a teacher that's adjusting. And maybe that's a disruptive effect, but that to me seems different than the disruptive effect that I was trying to get at, which isn't just that I have a new teacher who's particularly having trouble, but that's something that's more systemic. And so I'm going to put in a control essentially for, is your teacher a mover? Is that their first year in the school where they need to adjust, as well as what their teaching experience is? And then the third thing I might worry about is that the actual teacher effectiveness has changed. This is what I can't measure very well. So let's say I lose the bad teachers and get in kind of better or average teachers. I want to somehow adjust for that. Now the problem is that I don't have value added on every teacher in the district, so I can't do this for everybody. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to control for those first two in one set of models, and then I'm going to do a third with a different sample that actually tries to get at the achievement of the prior value added of the teacher that you have. So is it that you suddenly got a teacher that had a different prior value added than you did in years with a different level of turnover? Okay, so this is the kind of control for stuff way. The problem with that is, of course, there's characteristics of teachers that are probably not captured by prior value added that predict your learning, because this is an imprecise measure. So maybe there's still something left over. So the last thing that I'm going to do, I'm sure I have a slide that explains this too, but the last thing I'm going to do is just look at the kids who have teachers who were there the prior year and see if their achievement is different than other kids who have that same teacher in years where there isn't as high turnover in their grade. Okay, so I'm just going to eliminate all the kids who are taught by teachers who are new to the school and then see what I get. Okay, so these are two approaches. The first one adds controls. The experience of your teacher as the kid in that model that we did, which was a kid level model. What we've been focusing on is teacher turnover, which is a grade level variable. But for this, I'm going to control for their own teacher's experience, which will probably drop in years with higher turnover. I'm going to control for their own teachers whether or not they're a mover, new to the school, and I am going to include the prior value added of those kids' current teacher. And then I'm going to run the model separately just for stayer teachers. Okay, so this is the one that doesn't have anything. This is what we had before. This has experience, and this has a mover indicator and experience. And basically what this shows, you can see that the effect of turnover drops as I go through here. That having a lower experienced teacher explains part of the effect. And it's not always exactly the same, so that one moves from 0.074 to 0.063, and this one moves from 0.093 to 0.052. But you see in all cases that it drops, but it doesn't drop to zero. It's not just that the average experience of your teacher has dropped. Then in the next one, you get this mover variable, and that drops it just a little more, but usually not as much as the first drop. Okay, so basically what this is saying is just by adjusting for experience and for being a mover, you've captured part of the effect of turnover. Experience explains, oh, I'm so glad I did that, 15% to 50%. And with mover status, it explains 20% to 64%, depending on the model. So, this isn't particularly precise, but it's a start. And this is the school by grade one, where experience explains 21 to 76%, and the mover status explains 28 to 100%. Okay, now I need your watch. How am I doing? You have 40 minutes. Okay, uh-oh. That's way too much. You're going to have to help me. You're going to have to ask questions at the end and help me with new things to do. Okay. So then what I want to do with a much reduced sample is basically the same thing that I did before. I want to do this, I don't have it up here. Okay, I want to do the same thing I did before, but I want to control for the prior value added of the teacher that the student has to try to get at the fact that not only does it change experience, but you probably change the quality of what teacher. Again, that's going to lose all students who have first-year teachers. Because if you have a first-year teacher, I don't know their prior value added. I measure prior value added in two different ways. One is basically, I have what's called a student fixed effects model. So I estimate the effect of a teacher by comparing teachers who have served the same student. So I basically say a student on average learns this much in a given year. And then I get them as a teacher, and do they learn more or less than they usually learn in my classroom? And I take the average of that. Okay, good. And then the other one is just a basic control model. Do kids in my class learn more than similar kids who look similar to those kids? They're actually pretty highly correlated, the two of them, and the results are very similar with either of these controls. Okay. So this is the one with without. So this is the initial model, and this is the one where I add in average prior value added. And what's interesting is the initial model is going to look different because, again, it takes out all first-year teachers. It takes, it's gotten rid of everybody who I don't have prior value added for. And basically, again, it explains some of the difference, but not a whole lot. So the effect of proportion new drop or lagged attrition drops, so from 0.055 to 0.034, 0.063 to 0.049. But there is still a negative effect of average of turnover, even when you control for prior value added. What is interesting, I just wanted to put this up here, kind of low achieving and high achieving schools, is that with this sample where I don't have any first year teachers in and I only have prior value added, I don't find any effect for this sample of turnover or any significant effect of turnover on achievement for students in high performing schools.
What are the low and high?
It's just 50%, yeah.
Okay.
And you get the similar result if you do school by grade, the other kind of identification strategy. So compositional effects. There's some evidence that changes in experience, migration, and effectiveness explain much of the effect, but a significant effect remains unexplained even after that. And so that's the first kind of indication that there might be some disruptive change going on. But to examine this further, I'm just going to look at the effect of turnover on the kids of teachers who have not been affected, that they're in the same school, in the same grade they were last year.
So these are the kids who are in classrooms that some other teacher left.
No, these are only the kids these are the kids in classrooms of teachers who were teaching the same grade in the same school the prior year. So the idea of this is if turnover had an effect that was compositional, that would be on kids in classrooms where they had different teachers than they would have otherwise. And if it's disruptive or innovative, whatever you want to call it, then that would have to occur with kids of teachers who have been there before. Okay, and so that's what this is supposed to show. And basically, it's going to be a different sample because now you've just got the sample of stayers instead of the sample of everybody. And what you see is you still get negative effects. This is in all schools. I don't know why I put the table differently. This is in all schools, the school by year fixed effect and the school by grade fixed effect. And you can see that it's there. That's in math, and this is in English language arts. I don't see it with proportion new in all schools, so maybe for this one group there isn't a disruptive effect, but it could just be I've showed you 1,000 things, and if one thing's off, that's probably whatever, the random draw. But again, more of it with the more of the disruptive effect shows up generally in low-performing versus high-performing schools, but there's some indication that it's there in high-performing schools as well. So I think this shows some kind of disruptive effect just on stayers. Okay, here's the one where I count grade levers as levers instead of as stayers, and the results are really quite similar. They're bigger in math, again, than they are in ELA, but they're significant in both. I actually had to change the sample a little to do this, so I wouldn't compare them perfectly. What happens this is like typical of, for me, working with administrative data, the data that has the grade that the teacher teaches if they don't teach 4th and 5th grade, which I need for this, is different than the typical data that I use, which doesn't have it. So it's a little bit of a reduced sample that can tell me what other grades in the same school that teacher's in, which is why initially I defined it the way I did. But then I found this so that I could at least check it. Okay, so then this is my attempt to say, why don't I go back so that you don't read that? So I've been identifying it off of grade by school by year differences in turnover, so 4th grade in one year versus 4th or 5th grade in another year. And I think that's fairly convincing using these two different approaches, but ideally I would have some kind of independent or exogenous shock to turnover that I could look at. And so I tried, and basically I'm going to show you I couldn't get anything, but what I tried to do was to predict the turnover in the grade by when teachers were eligible for retirement. And in New York, there are two kind of benefits of retiring, one at 55 and one at 62. And you see a lot of teachers retiring either at 55 or at 62. So I basically said, how many teachers in your grade or how many teachers in your school in a particular year are in the 4th and 5th grade are retiring, and use that to instrument turnover. The trick is that it's different than traditional turnover because it's very well planned, right? We know this turnover is going to happen. That just seems like a different thing, but this is all excuses for why I'm going to show you I don't quite find the same thing, though certainly the direction is good. It just kind of blows up the standard errors. So what this shows is that I'm predicting whether or not you retire by I'm predicting lagged attrition and proportion new, and this is actually at the school level, but we did it both at the school and the school by grade level, is predicted by the percent who are 55 and the percent who are 62, bigger at 62 than at 55. And then we also, because we worried that that was just kind of reflecting demographic differences across places, we also put in other kind of controls for age that were more likely to capture things like, do you have a lot of new teachers in the school? Do you have a lot of old teachers, the average age, and stuff like that. So this is what our instrument is identified off of. So I get all negative effects of turnover. They continue to be negative effects of turnover, but right now my standard errors are really high. And my hope is that I'll get to something where I can get the standard errors in again. I think this doesn't provide strong evidence that turnover is not negative, but I don't see the, but I can't identify it precisely. Okay. The summary of the findings, it's an initial analysis. Teacher turnover on average has a negative effect of student achievement in English language arts and math. The effects are strongest in schools with low performing and black students, teacher experience being a new teacher to a school, and effectiveness explain much but not all of the effect. And so that compositional explanation appears to be more than half of the effect, but there's still evidence of a disruptive effect beyond the change in teacher composition. Particularly in low-performing schools, students of stayers do worse in the years with more turnover. And I think that's as much of a presentation as I prepared, but I'm totally happy. What I'd love is for you to tell me how to do this better, what your worries are, and stuff like that. So as we go forward in this, we have a better sense of what to do. And it's really just kind of our beginning of trying to understand. We look at teachers largely as individuals in schools, and it's the beginning of our hope to understand kind of the role of the school in both the current effectiveness of teachers and also in their improvement over time. So once you do, how about this for incentives? Once you help me with that, I will share with you the poem that Jason wrote when I said, how should I present this as a poem? And he said, well, I've got one for you. So that's the next slide, as long as I can get some good feedback. Yeah.
Everybody's got to have something.
Exactly. So do you have any questions or can help me or do anything like that?
To ward off the poem reading, I mean, it's almost surely the case that you're underestimating the effect of teacher turnover, right? You can think of this is a very specific kind of turnover because it's the turnover that happens for the other teachers that are within your specific grade. But I mean, you can imagine that there could be effects of the first and second grade teacher turning over coincident in the same year. So they're not teaching those students, they turn over and there's some effects because of disruption, right? The fourth and fifth grade teacher is distracted because, for whatever reason, right?
Yeah.
I mean, when people talk about kind of justifying looking at, so things I've done have been kind of predicting who turns over, and you write about you kind of hypothesize what the costs are, and people say things like, well, there's search costs that are involved, and it's very expensive for a principal to go out. And so that's resources that could be allocated to other things. And so, I mean, do you have ideas for other, because there are disruptive effects potentially that, I mean, you're just sort of suggesting, yes, there are disruptive effects, but there's lots of reasons to think that you could really be underestimating what those disruptive effects might be.
Yes, I think that's right. And so that's why we were trying to think in some ways of, so it depends, I mean, I think it depends. So is the cost of something like going out and trying to find new teachers, does that mean that resources from the school are being dragged to something else, like principal's time is now spent interviewing new teachers and stuff like that? That should kind of be picked. No, I guess if it affects the whole school, it won't be picked up in here. So it has to particularly affect the grade. It has to be kind of the other teachers in the grade have to spend some time trying to hire that particular one for that kind of cost to occur. Yeah, so I don't really have a good I mean, I tried this instrument. I've thought of other instruments as well, but they're really kind of hard to get a grip on. So there's a fair number of TFA teachers, are they in their second year? Then they're much more likely to leave. But I'm not, that seems like my sample's getting so specific. Ellen?
Well, it seems like if you want to test disruptive effects that you could, with other data, test it directly. So the hypothesis would be in schools that have collaborative cultures or a sense of trust or something else going on, that there would be more disruption for those schools if the teachers turn over than in schools where everyone's totally autonomous, working in their own rooms where there's no collaboration going on. You could probably think about what else we know about schools or firms, organizations, like is there more distributed leadership? Is there more teaming? Is there team teaching? Is there advising? I mean, there's lots of other things going on in schools where one would expect that the disruption would be higher than in other types of schools.
So that's nice. So Jason and I do surveys where we can, so in New York we have climate surveys, but we can't link them directly to teachers, so we don't know what grades they're in and stuff like that. But in Miami we could. So we could see, not even whether it's the effect is worse in those schools, because that's a little harder, but we could see whether when there's turnover, if the collegiality or something drops, or some of those kinds of things, the help that you think you get from your colleagues drops. Of course, somebody has to answer our surveys for us to be able to do that. Yeah.
There's some mechanisms here that you said, you know, and I know
Yeah.
Jason, that you're really looking at what's happening in organizations, and I think there's some mechanism here that this approach to the notion of disruption could be interesting to explore.
Could be capturing. Yeah, no, I like that. Yeah.
Do you have information on either when the leaver gave notice, like when that position became like a potential vacancy, or when it was filled?
We do know when things are filled, but we don't know when they give or we don't know when they leave, and sometimes that's we know when they leave if they leave in the middle of the year, but if they're leaving at the end of the school year, we can't see when they gave notice. Largely because principals will not share that, because they in the past have been forced to take teachers, so they don't want that. So how would that help?
No, I was just thinking about, you would think that there'd be cases where it would be particularly disruptive when the notice was late and or when it took a long time to fill the vacancy.
Yeah. No, that's good. Yeah.
Kind of related to that question, so like instead of notice, if you know the timing of leave, like if the turnover events are clustered or not, may matter. So like so two schools have both like 10% turnover, but in one school, all the turnover happened in like May and June, whereas in another school it kind of spreads out across the year. So that may impact differently in the disruption.
Yeah, so largely because I'm lazy, I've only looked at turnover, from year to year, though some of this turnover could have happened earlier on. I could, with work, see, and I do think that's an interesting question, of course, the teachers who are leaving in the middle of the year. But I haven't looked, don't have those variables in my data, but I should get them. Yeah.
So I'm just
Oh,
thinking
sorry.
out loud. I probably wouldn't even ask this question if we didn't have sufficient time, but thinking out loud.
Sorry, I talk too fast. I should, it's a New York problem.
So you're basically trying to control for the school effect by comparing across 4th to 5th, right, in the same year.
Mm-hmm.
So you're putting a lot of pressure on that 4th grade group, right?
Yeah.
And saying this is representative of what's going on in the school. Am I thinking right so far?
For the 5th grade, yes. So in the school by year effect one, you're putting a lot of pressure on that.
So one of the questions it raises in my mind is, these are fairly small samples, right? That 4th grade only has 6 teachers.
Yeah.
Could you look to see how representative 4th grade is to the other grades, even though they don't have test scores, to see if it is fairly representative?
So if the turnover there is representative, yeah. So yes, you are comparing it to that other grade in the same year. But the one that has grade by year, grade by school fixed effects and year fixed effects, that one is looking at the 5th grade across all the sample years. So it's got a little bit more comparison. But yes, it's a 4th to 5th grade. I can look at it in the other grades as well. So I could look at the turnover of teachers across grades. What's interesting too is the movement of teachers within schools. That's a kind of totally different paper, but one we're looking at. And there's a lot of systematic movement of teachers out of the 4th and 5th grade who are not as good, essentially, because these are the tested grades in the school. Yes, so I could do that. So compare the turnover. So how would I do that? Because I don't have achievement in there. So
I'm trying to see how representative turnover is across the grades.
Well, you said that it's particularly low in 4th and 5th.
it's lower generally in elementary schools than it's the highest in middle schools and then high schools and then elementary.
Yeah. I guess I was just trying to see, you don't have to have test scores, but you could just see if the turnover.
I could definitely check it. I'm just trying to think about how to get that into the model.
Yeah, I don't know how you can model. I was doing it as a check.
Check. Oh yeah, no, I could totally do that as a check to see how similar they are. Yeah.
So some of the talk about sort of like when teachers realize they're not going to be coming back the next year,
Uh-huh.
Whether that happens in the spring, just makes me wonder if this would be interesting to look at the effect of this turnover, maybe not lag like on the year itself. So I'm a teacher, I know I'm leaving at the end of the year, I kind of check out, stop teaching.
Do I do worse in the year before, like the
Right.
year before effect?
Like a bunch of people that you know are not coming back, does that actually affect that year before they leave?
Yeah. So that must be in there somewhere. So some people who have looked at whether worse teachers leave must have allowed for a prior year. I mean, maybe they haven't. If not, you should do that. It would be a very easy thing to see. I mean, I'm assuming they're worse in the year before they go.
They are.
Yeah.
There's a dip.
The Ashenfelter dip in the year before. Yeah, no, that would be good. So how would that, I mean, if anything, that should make this look less, that should bias it towards finding less of an effect if the year before was worse. And I think that's generally true, that we worry that something bad happened the prior year that caused people to leave, or just that they were leaving so they didn't do very well. But this is actually worse in the next year. Whoops. So, yeah, well, who would like to talk to Eric? Okay, any? Yeah.
Do you have any access to data on like why people leave?
Yeah, so we do. In fact, we just ran a survey. So, I wish I could pull it up. I'm not going to. So if you ask people why they leave, some of them say salary and things like that, but overwhelmingly they'll say it has something to do with the functioning of the school. If you're looking at teachers in their first 5 years or something like that, and not the retirement end. And then if you ask them about the specific aspects of the school, there's a little bit about I'm not doing a very good job. There's a little bit about student misbehavior, and then almost everybody puts the administration of the school as the main reason that they leave. And even if you take we did one survey, kind of school climate survey, and we aggregated it up to the school level in 1 year and then predicted turnover using all these measures of things like collegiality and the administrative support, student misbehavior and stuff. And administrative support is totally what predicts turnover later on. So that's actually what led us initially to start to look at leadership, and I'm sure the people here who do the leadership stuff think that that's true too, that even in the schools that usually lose students, like low achieving schools, the administrators can change that somehow if they're good. So yeah.
I wrote a question. I'm thinking about the supports. Earlier in one of the beginning, you talked about the types of support. So when you're talking about leadership or administration, are you just talking about the principal leadership, or are you talking about the leadership like coaching and facilitating and things like that?
Yeah.
That could keep teachers possibly, or that could impact leavers or not leavers?
Yes, so I don't know. I think other people here will know that better. I'm assuming it's a combination of both. And my sense is that the role of the kind of head leadership team, so the principal and the assistant principal, is largely to create structures like that in schools that are supportive. So I think it's all of that. We looked at some things about coaches, but it's very hard to see kind of direct coach effects on things like that. But certainly I think that would be an example of the kinds of supports that these folks do. I'm trying to think what other teacher turnover stuff that we have. I mean, one interesting teacher turnover thing in terms of the supports and who leaves and stuff like that is we did this study recently where we looked at schools that were doing particularly well and what turnover looked like there and how that compared to turnover in schools that didn't seem to be doing well in terms of student learning. And those schools that were doing well were able to keep their highest performing teachers. There was actually very little difference in their ability to get rid of their less effective teachers, but there was substantial difference in their ability to keep their high performers. And so I think that's kind of you know, an interesting dimension to think about turnover on, because we're not saying there's no potentially positive compositional effect. I don't want this to be taken at all like all turnover is bad. I actually think there's the other thing, just keep talking about my research, I've got time. The other thing we've been looking about is over their first few years, how much teachers learn and where they start. So if you're a low performing teacher, whether or not you tend to learn over the first few years, and whether you're a high-performing teacher, whether you bounce around. The people who are good tend to stay good. The people who are bad, some stay bad and some improve. So there is potential to improve among those, but you can really identify the good teachers, the kind of exceptional teachers pretty early, and they're pretty likely to stay exceptional. So the extent that you can keep those teachers, I think, is a kind of a beneficial thing. The low-performing teachers, you know, some get better, but on average, they don't get that good either. So you know, there could be good compositional changes you can make.
Something you kind of pointed out, I think you talked about the idea of the overall effect. For me, the Teach for America thing is what I'm thinking about. I'm surprised that there hasn't been more research on that. If this is what you see with teacher turnover, then that program just seems like a teacher turnover program. And I don't understand. I'm thinking about that. Like, how does that, you know, how is that, you know, fit into this idea we're talking about?
So, I mean, one thing was that just one thought about that is that if you remember well, you didn't show this, but you actually said it, right, that in the very lowest achieving schools, the turnover effect wasn't as big, and that might be where a lot of the TFA folks are concentrated.
And that, I mean, you could still have a bad effective teacher turnover, but since it's consistent and something, the marginal difference doesn't matter so much. I mean, I think TFA, it's tricky that way. So in something like elementary schools where TFA isn't kind of differentially better than the other teachers that schools can currently attract, I think worrying about these things makes a lot of sense, and worrying about turnover. There are certain areas where TFA teachers seem, you know, that are really substantially better. In New York, when we were looking at middle school math in the poorest schools, they really did a better job than the other teachers that those schools were able to attract. I don't think that means that it's fair that it's hard for those schools to attract teachers, or that we don't want to make other ways of making them more appealing places and you don't need it, and so teachers will stay and be good. But at this point, the TFA teachers are the best math teachers that those schools are getting, and so I wouldn't want to get rid of TFA. They're better in their first year than most of the other math teachers get to be, so you have to worry about that as well. There was a traditional route that also produced really good teachers, but not on average, like not the others. There was like 1 out of 5 that was producing really good teachers as well. So I think traditional routes can do as well. They just weren't doing as well for those schools. There.
I think even this, to me, it spoke a little bit more, in this conversation, spoke more about the effects of teacher turnover on teachers and the schools than it does even necessarily on how students, or at least how the teachers are relating to their students, more than the students themselves. And I think that it would be very interesting to look at the schools that have traditionally high turnover. Is it partially a self-perpetuating issue? Is it more because those are low-performing, difficult schools to work with because of the student body? Or is how much of it is the fact that these teachers don't have support and they're constantly having this effect on themselves? As a structural thing?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question. So, I mean, I think this in some ways shows that potentially shows that there's a negative effect of turnover on student achievement, but that it's likely driven by the effects of teachers on each other. And Bo Jackson has a nice paper on the effects of teachers. Do you know that? on each other, where, you know, how good your colleagues are kind of affects how well you do, or, you know, I could see it too being that there's something about the school where everybody gets better. I don't really know what's driving those results. And then the kind of
Impossible to measure, but
yeah, and then the circular nature is really hard to get at it. Is it actually the kids themselves, or is it that the kids have brought a certain kind of atmosphere to the school initially that isn't really about the kids, but is then about your colleagues? You know, we find that principals, the poor schools are more likely to get first-time principals or uncertified principals kind of thing, and then they just move along into the higher achieving schools. So maybe your leadership team isn't as good in those places. But on a positive note, it seems like the kind of zone schools, star schools, these few schools that districts focus on, they can actually turn around what's going on there. They can reduce turnover. They can do these kinds of things. So I think that some kind of focus on this, it's not like it's you know, set because of the students in the school. Or I don't think it is. Yeah.
Well, so you probably have heard before that the results just don't seem right. They seem too strong. And I'm having trouble thinking about what I know about schools, and in particular New York City schools. And why would these disruptive effects be so large? And so I'm kind of, it strikes me that it would be interesting to do the kind of thing I think Ron was driving at, but for a completely different reason. Suppose you took the position that, well, you know, turnover in a nearby grade, an adjacent grade, is going to be more disruptive than turnover in a far off grade. I mean, I'm a 5th grade teacher. Turnover in 4th grade might have a real impact on me. The kids are going to be, you know, it's just going to, but turnover in kindergarten or 1st grade, I hardly would notice. My kids just don't associate with those kids. They don't go out at recess at the same time. They're just almost a different world. So you can measure turnover at those grade levels. You just can't measure achievement. But
Yeah.
So it would strike me that you could at least test whether that were true. And if you got really strong coefficients, if there was no indication of any decline as you spaced the grades further apart, that it turned out that 1st grade turnover was just as important on 5th grade as on 2nd grade, then I would really start wondering, what are you really measuring? Because that really wouldn't seem right.
So how would I figure out the effect? I don't think the effects are that big. That's interesting. Because they're big if you look at them for 100% turnover, but so few do 100% turnover. So that seems like an unreasonable bit.
Well, say they're not big.
Yeah.
My question would still
No, okay, so I'm defending. I think they're like reasonable size turnover. But yeah, so how would I do that? So I could see 3rd grade turnover maybe should have a bigger effect on 4th grade than on 5th grade, if I think 3rd grade turnover will affect 4th grade. And I think that might depend on something like what Ellen was saying, how much there's cross-grade work and things like that. But how do I figure out the effect of, you know, on 3rd grade or something, the effect of 2nd grade turnover? I don't have those. Okay, so it's just...
You would just be asking the question, is 1st grade turnover less important
to 4th grade than 2nd? Oh yeah, I could totally do that. That would be feasible. So let me try that. I like that.
I think it would depend on how large the school is too. I mean, in a school where I taught with only 2 teachers per grade level, you're much more likely to have interaction with your 3rd grade teachers than in a larger school.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Yes, I mean, at this point we're assuming that there's no effect of other grade turnover on your grade. And so this would be, so the identification, I'm just trying to see again, since I've only been looking at your grade and comparing you to the other grade in the school or your same grade in different years, I'm just taking this as a separate variable.
You're allowing the coefficient to be different, so I'm not sure it would get wiped out by fixed effects.
Yeah, no, it shouldn't. It should be okay. I could have the effect both on 4th grade turnover, both on 4th grade achievement and on 5th grade achievement of 3rd grade turnover, 2nd grade turnover, 1st grade turnover. Yeah, that's great. I love that. I will do that. Okay. Let's hope it works. Yeah.
So is there a reason you didn't include the square turnover rate term in your equation?
Actually, we did try that. We tried to look at nonlinearities of it, and you see that a little bit because we did the quartiles of it. We actually didn't find that it was particularly nonlinear, even though we kind of expected it to be. And part of that is it's most schools have about 6 teachers in a grade, and so there's not a lot of ways of parameterizing that. Yeah. And some have 4. Yeah, no, that's nice. Anything else that I could do? Any other instruments that you can think of that I?
That was a fair. I'm sorry.
What?
I was just going to goof around.
I was just scared. The instrument that you were using, were you predicting turnover as the first way that you measured it, where people in the school still that like don't count as leavers, or were you doing it where if you leave the school?
So I did it both ways. So and they were the same way. So the lagged attrition is the proportion in your grade that retired, essentially, that left the school. Yeah. I actually think I may now have an instrument because New York didn't tenure about 50% of their teachers who came up for tenure last year, and that doesn't. It doesn't mean they left or anything, but my hope is that it means that they were less likely to stay, and maybe I can get something off of that.
It just seemed if you could look at whether or not these disruptions were lasting, like if you could just go another year into the future.
Yeah.
Particularly if the composition then held relatively steady. If you don't have that same rate of turnover every year.
Yeah. So you have this year's lagged attrition and you have last year's lagged attrition. And you can have both of them in the model. Yeah, that would be interesting to look at as well, to see if these things stay. Right now, I'm pretty much comparing them to the average over the whole period. But that's definitely doable, and I can take a look at that. That's good. Anything else?
That was a fairly solid performance. I think we got the palm.
Oh, sorry. Once there was a teacher named Beth who hated her school, so she left for Beth a good path, but the next year in math, the students did much worse on tests. Okay, thank you.